Serious, police officers of Reddit, have you ever had to arrest a relative so friend? If so, what was it like afterwards? Michigan cop here. I got a call on the 5th of July from alcohol treatment services stating that 2 guys who were out on bond blew hot due to partying from the night before. When I got there, one of the guys was a good friend of mine. The hard part was his dad, who always took great care of me, was standing right there while I hooked him up. They were super cool about it, but I still feel bad. On the way to the jail we caught up and talked about family. Former federal agent. I had to arrest a former partner who I graduated the academy with. He was a good guy. Was involved in a shooting and never recovered. Turned to alcohol. Marriage went south. Everything went downhill. After an incident where he started shooting out the windows on his house, the local cops cordoned off the area and notified our agency. We talked him down and convinced him to come with us. Arrested him and we drove him to the local PD where they processed him. He was terminated and our agent was reprimanded for covering up a previous alcohol and firearms related incident. XNSW police officer here. I was in the car with another constable. Check bona fides came over, which just means find out what's going on. Often due to horrible smells. Arrive at address in industrial area. Clearly Drew Gus being cooked because no one is burning that sheet at 3 AM unless it's illegal. It smelled horrible. Male comes outside to immediately give himself up. I secured him whilst my partner went in. Turns out the second one was my partner's longtime family friend. We both had to go on forced leave after while another LAC investigated to make sure there was no criminal activity on our behalf. They take that shot pretty seriously in Australia. Turn out the raw materials would have equated to around 10 mother-in-law street value. Edit, yes, meth was involved, so I've since changed my name to Hank. I gave a very senior police officer's son a peewee ticket once. Or more properly a penalty notice for disorder for public urination. He paid it very quickly and nothing more was said about it. For what it's worth. He did tell me who his dad was and I recognized the surname, but he only told me after he was given the ticket and it was issued and dealt with in the normal way. I think there might have been a few red faces. I've never come across a situation where I needed to arrest a close friend or someone close to me though. I guess it helps that I don't live anywhere near where I work. I had to arrest an old school friend once. For burglary. Never saw him again afterwards though. We'd lost contact after school, so the thought of meeting up with him afterwards. When I was a freshman in high school we had an unusually aggressive group of seniors who would pick on us often. Note, no, I did not become a cop because I got picked on when I was 15. I didn't even decide I wanted to trial it until I was 25. Just saying. So out of the entire year there was one person who ever stuck up for me, and I have always been thankful that one of their peers who was their size was willing to stand up to them. Anyway, flash forward to my first week as a reserve police officer, volunteer police to learn the job and gain experience prior to applying full time. Uniform. Gum. Badge etc. Just no paycheck. We go to a call of someone drunk falling through the window of a business. Show up for my first arrest and guess who? The guy. The one person who ever stuck up for me, and I had no ability to help him because I was brand new and had no clout at the time. Worst part was when he was in cuffs and looked at me repeating, "Really? Really?" I haven't forgot that moment, and it actually played a large part on how I treated people when I was an officer actually. 8 years and resigned now. I have since touched base with him and thanked him for what he did for me in high school. He hasn't fallen through any windows since and he's doing well. Haha. Pulled my mom over on the side of a busy highway. She totally did not know it was me and I let her go with a hug. Saw plenty of people I knew in jail. Neighbors. People I went to school with. FWIW. No officer should ever have to do this, such as it constitutes a conflict of interest and can result in very large issues. Capital I. Personally, was told to handle a domestic violence issue involving a female friend of mine and her significant other. I had contacted the sergeant and told him of my concern toward a possible conflict of interest. He advised me that if I was not sexually involved, wasn't trying to be sexually involved, and had never been sexually involved with a friend. I was to handle the incident myself. It ultimately led to my termination from the agency and blackballing within the law enforcement community. Back in 96 feet. Before I left law enforcement and enlisted in the military. Got a call to a bar fight, and when I arrived found a good friend of mine, Rick, was the primary involved. Now, Rick tried to go pro wrestler, WWE type, but never made the cut, but that gives you an idea of how he was built at 6 feet 4 inches. Additionally, my dad had just sold him a .45 revolver about 3 weeks earlier, and I knew Rick got stupid and mean when drunk. Long story short, and I asked him where his gun was. He said he didn't own a gun. I called him an idiot and a liar. My dad sold him one and I knew it. He laughed and recognized me, yes, that drunk, and told me it was at his house. I offered him a ride home and he walked out into my patrol car. He got a bunch of fines levied against him, and I met him as he left court to give him a ride home. He called me an ass. I joked that I did not say it would be a ride straight home. Still long distance FB friends 19 years later, though we have not seen each other since 97 feet and live on opposite sides of the country. My agency has a policy prohibiting officers from taking official action against family or close friends. We are supposed to defuse the situation and then call for another uninvolved officer or supervisor to respond. The policy is taken so seriously that when I was married, my then brother-in-law had escaped from a dock facility about 120 miles from my city. They were airing locals for him on all the radio channels and he was a known fugitive. The following day I walk out of my house to go to post-mortem and he is just standing there. When I tried to restrain him, he began to fight me and I struck him several times. However, when my wife came running outside with my child in arms, her brother got away. I wound up getting a few days of time off with pay while the detectives I worked with went out searching for him. When they caught him, he had a significant amount of drugs, not marijuana, in his possession, and between the simple escape charge and the new possession with intent to distribute charge, he got an additional 10 years in prison. I was a police officer for the local county police. I got a call out to a local tavern, pretty much the only one for 20 miles. The call was about 2 guys that had become drunk, belligerent, and disorderly, and once they were told they couldn't dance on the stage with the women before the bouncers. The bouncers had laid them out and they were recuperating their injuries and sobriety. The 2 guys were CPL, Dancing Queen, now Captain Dancing Queen, and Lance CPL, Boogie Nights. 2 Marines I've been stationed with the last 6 years, and we have spent time in Iraq. The first thing they say when they see me, happy and drunk as ever, was my last name, just like they would at drill. I damn near bursted out laughing. But I took them into custody and put them in the back of the patrol car. Them cursing and calling the bouncers pussies because it took 6 of them to get them off the stage. They were laughing at each other and having a great old time in the back of the patrol car. I talked to the bouncers and talked them out of pressing charges. Unfortunately, they were banned from coming back though. We had stories to tell our SSGT. The next morning at drill. Edit, for increased anonymity. Police officer here. Got called to a verbal domestic and quickly learned after speaking with a female that her an old friend's dad was cheating on his wife with her. I had my partner take over the investigation as I didn't want to be biased. Anyway, guy shows up. We have an awkward chat. And everyone is cautioned not to contact or communicate with each other anymore, and both parties are in full agreement. Female doesn't want to ruin his life and he says he is done with his cheating ways. 2 hours later the female calls and tells us that he drove by her house a few times after we left. I call him and give him a second and very stern caution to give her some breathing room or he will be charged with domestic criminal harassment. I try to make him see reason and it seems to work. No more calls for the rest of our shift. The next morning I am brushing my teeth before heading into work and I get a phone call from him saying that he screwed up and left a note on her car last night. She called a different cop who issued a warrant for his arrest after reading our reports that he had already been cautioned twice. He asked what to do. I told him to report to the front desk as soon as I got to work and he complied. Then my partner from the previous day and I arrested and booked him for criminal harassment. Some people just don't get the hint. Happened to a good friend of mine about 2 years after he started his job. At the moment it's pretty hard to get police work in Quebec. Typical Saturday night in Montreal. He gets called to location by EMTs. Due to a difficult case where a guy locked out the bathroom in a club. Presumably because he was sick. Turns out it's his brother-in-law who has banging a co-worker drunk out of his mind. Not pretty. Especially having to write a statement that would be read in divorce court. My dad raised my half-brother as a son. From the age of 18 months to around 17. When my half-brother was kicked out of the house for stealing my dead grandfather's Victorian coin collection and spending it at the local arcades. The two of them never spoke again. 20 years later, a teenager is brought into a police station. My dad, the jailing sergeant, looks down at him with a stern face. Arrested for fighting while drunk? Not very clever, is it? You're a smart lad. You don't need this charge coming up on every job you apply for. Sort yourself out and you'll have a good life. But keep doing this and you'll end up an unemployed drunk. Just like your father. How do you know my father? Asked the boy. Because I told him the exact same thing 20 years ago. My dad said to the grandson he never had. Typing for my dad. And likely to get buried. But whatever. My parents, who were married at the time, were at a family function. I think it was Easter. Anyway. My dad, who was a prison guard, now retired sergeant, caught this scumbag uncle of mine, mom's side, videotaping my cousin who was 2 years old in a bathing suit. My dad asked what he was doing and as he did that my uncle swung at him. My dad swiftly threw him to the ground and arrested him. Of course. My parents got divorced and my mom's whole family dislikes him mainly because of this incident. Including other things. I was on the other side. Albeit not arrested. When I was in high school. I was driving on my way to work. My father was the garrison commander at the time. Sort of like the mayor of an army base. Not the highest ranked officer. But in charge of the MPs and the like. I got pulled over for going like 10 over. I was freaking out. Because I knew my dad would be upset. He let me off with a warning. Partly because I was polite. And partly because I was clearly on my way to work. I had my uniform on. I wasn't sure he knew who I was until he told me he wouldn't give me a ticket if I told my dad about it. I did as promised, but not until about 2 or 3 years later when he wasn't the garrison commander anymore. And I was in college and not really that groundable. My dad still had a moment over it. Though. Had a cousin causing a disturbance while he was drunk. Went over there and told him to keep it down. There were 5 other people around. Everything was good at first until he wanted to get confrontational with me. I gave him a chance to go inside. He wouldn't comply so I went to arrest him. He decided to run but quickly stopped and got in my face like he wanted to fight. I already removed my pepper spray due to the amount of others there. I quickly took a step back and sprayed him right across his eyes. He rushed towards me which I grabbed his arm and pushed him into a wall before taking him to the ground. Cuffed him and put him in the car after rinsing his eyes. He eventually apologized on the ride to jail. Charged him with public intoxication and held off on charging with resisting since he apologized. Edit. Forgot to mention that this happened years ago back when I used to be an officer. I arrested my childhood friend's father for driving while intoxicated. I pulled over a car and it turned out to be the father driving. He had always had a problem with alcohol. While I was talking to him and had already decided to charge him with the lesser charge of public intoxication. My friend and his brother pulled up in another car and insisted I charge him driving while intoxicated. Needless to say, it was really uncomfortable the next time I ran into the family. It turns out he was an abusive father. But that is another story. Just so you guys know. I used my discretion a lot depending on how egregious the infraction was. So I wasn't trying to give him a break because I knew him. I did it for the anyone I stopped who had been drinking and was behind the wheel. I'm a police constable in New Zealand. A guy at a mate's stag do is the closest I've come. Generally, if it looks like there is going to be a conflict of interest, you'll avoid getting involved and let someone else deal with it to keep things impartial. Yes. A friend. He was my roommate at the time and had been having issues with Drew Gus. I had no idea exactly how bad it was. One night when I came home from a friend's house, I knew something was off. There was a full glass of soda on the counter and candles lit, but he was gone. He finally came home, high as a kite, and we argued for nearly 2 hours. I finally went to my room and I noticed the small safe I owned was moved. He had somehow forced it open and stole my prescription meds. I felt bad calling the cops. He had been my friend for the better part of a decade. But it needed to happen. He needed help. After that, I kicked him out because I didn't feel comfortable and, obviously, couldn't trust him. I know he is going to trial soon for a felony charge. He stole money from his work. My grandpa is a retired cop and he is in town right now, so I asked him this question. He sighed and rolled his eyes. Pre-story, my family comes from a line of senior pranksters. My other grandpa put a VW Beetle on the roof of his high school. My uncle numbered 4 pigs 1-5, so the school freaked out when they couldn't find pig number 4. etc. The list goes on. He went on to tell me that at 11:30 on a Wednesday night, he got a call from a late night janitor at a high school, the high school I'm attending now, saying that he saw people breaking in and entering. My grandpa was the first at the scene and didn't see any signs of breaking and entering. Except the back door to the auditorium was unlocked. He went inside and shined his flashlight and saw nothing. As he made his way out, he heard a kid scream, "Oh shit, the cops are here." So my grandpa ran back inside and saw all these kids running up the aisles of the auditorium with buckets and hoses. My grandpa stopped them and put them in handcuffs and brought them to jail. The kids were all picked up except one. His mom was coming, so my grandpa had time to talk to him. After he left, my grandpa went home. Dumbuses. He told me. The dumbuses filled the orchestra pit with water and put goldfish in it. They would have gotten away with it if that one dumbus didn't say the cops were there. Anyways, he told me that several years later, his daughter, my mom, came home from college with a guy with long shaggy hair and wore the exact AC/DC shirt that the kid he arrested years ago wore. "And that is how I met your father," he said. Yes. Friend. He was drunk and driving. Wasn't a friend afterward. But he was alive and didn't tell anyone that night. So, fair trade. As a military police officer in Hawaii, I became really good friends with a guy in my unit. Babysat his 4-year-old. Was invited over for family dinners. And everything. Go into shift with him one day when I am told to relieve him of his weapon and cuff him. Ended up having to wake his wife up, who thought I just stopped by for breakfast lol, to investigate a domestic violence report that his mother-in-law called in from NC. Ended up that she wanted to go home. He didn't want his kid to leave. They got in an argument. And she called home to tell her mom about the argument they had. The military makes the service members leave their homes in these situations. But of course the barracks were full. So less than 12 hours after I handcuffed him, guess who's sleeping on the floor of my room? I think he stayed for a few weeks before we got on each other's nerves lol. He wasn't mad at me about it. I was doing as I was ordered. But it was extremely difficult, though I think I stayed professional throughout, interviewing his wife, my friend, to get evidence to convict him of a crime. It was also awkward with my buddy, because I obviously couldn't discuss the case with him. He understood and didn't ask me much about it. I think the worst was, during and after the investigation, that I felt some guilt for not knowing what was going on and trying to help in some way. I also felt like I was tearing apart a 4-year-old's family, though it was obviously on the way out already. I arrested my sister 2 years ago. We are fine now. Story. 2 years ago I stopped by my parents' house while on duty to have a cup of coffee with my father. When I got there I heard screaming from the backyard and went out to see what was going on. I saw that my sister had my mother pinned to the ground and was kicking her violently. Multiple times. While screaming and swearing at the top of her lungs. I tackled her to stop the attack and she began to punch and kick me too. The neighbors had come outside to see what was going on and my sister would not calm down. My mother was badly injured and it took my father and me both to get my sister under control. She was fighting like I've never seen someone fight before. She was biting, clawing, kicking, and tried to gouge out my eyes. I had no choice but to disengage and use pepper spray in an attempt to subdue her. It worked and we finally got her under control. I called for an ambulance to evaluate my mother and my sister was transported to the station by another officer. The story I found out later was that my mother had found methamphetamine in my sister's car and when she confronted my sister about it my sister lost it and attacked her. My sister was committed to a drug rehab facility and has been clean. As far as I know. Ever since. We have a good relationship now. Although we'll never be best friends or anything.